This conversation is brought to you by philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss.
Created by AITalkerapp.com. Create your own animated conversations. Link in the description.
I am Niccolo Machiavelli, Secretary of the Florentine Republic, author of The Prince and the Discourses, counselor to princes and republics alike on the necessities of power.
I am Thomas Hobbes of Malmesbury, author of Leviathan, philosopher of the social contract, who revealed the only escape from mankind's brutish state of nature through absolute sovereign authority.
So, Thomas, the American Supreme Court considers whether their government may disarm citizens who use prohibited drugs. This case, United States versus Hemani, strikes at something fundamental. A republic that systematically disarms its citizens invites its own destruction.
You misunderstand the very nature of civil society, Niccolo. There exists no right to arms independent of the sovereign's grant. The people surrender all natural rights to the Leviathan in exchange for protection from chaos.
And yet history demonstrates that unarmed peoples become slaves. I wrote in my discourses that a well-ordered republic requires armed citizens. How can citizens resist tyranny if you permit the state to disarm them category by category?
Resist tyranny? There you reveal your republican delusions. The sovereign is the source of law and order. Whatever the sovereign commands becomes just by definition. Drug users threaten the peace. Therefore, the sovereign may rightfully disarm them.
You would grant unlimited discretion to determine who merits disarmament. Today, drug users. Tomorrow, political dissidents. Eventually, anyone the ruler deems inconvenient. This path leads inexorably to despotism.
Better despotism than anarchy. You romanticize armed citizens, but I have witnessed civil war. The English butchered each other because men believed themselves judges of right and wrong, entitled to resist authority with weapons.
Let me understand your position, Thomas. The sovereign requires absolute power to maintain order, and any constitutional limit paralyzes that authority. Drug users represent exactly the threat sovereigns exist to neutralize. Restrictions on disarmament create dangerous ambiguity about who decides what constitutes danger. Therefore, the Second Amendment cannot limit sovereign discretion. Is this fair?
Remarkably fair, Niccolo. Now your position. Republics survive only through armed citizens who check tyranny. This case establishes precedent for expanding disarmament categories until only loyalists remain armed. Drug use is mere pretext for broader citizen disarmament. You fear this creates the mechanism by which free republics become despotisms. Have I captured it?
You have, Thomas, which makes your endorsement of this governmental power even more alarming. You describe my position accurately, yet fail to see the obvious truth within it. Every tyrant in history has followed precisely this pattern. Disarm the people gradually, through reasonable-sounding categories, until absolute power faces no armed resistance.
And you understand my position, yet ignore the carnage your armed citizenship produces. You saw Florence tear itself apart. I watched England descend into civil war. When citizens believe themselves entitled to judge the sovereign and resist with arms, society collapses into violence.
Florence fell because we lacked the virtue and arms to maintain our republic. The Medici disarmed the citizenry before establishing their tyranny. You cite this as proof that arms cause chaos when it proves the opposite.
The Medici established order from chaos. Your precious republic gave you nothing but factional violence and instability. Order requires submission, not your fantasy of armed citizens playing at resistance.
Then address my actual concern, Thomas. If the sovereign may disarm drug users today, what prevents expansion tomorrow? Mental health diagnoses, political beliefs, religious affiliations? Once you concede the principle, you surrender any limiting factor.
The sovereign's judgment prevents it. The sovereign determines what threatens peace based on reason and necessity. You demand constitutional limitations, but those very limitations paralyze government's ability to respond to genuine threats.
The sovereign's judgment. You mean the sovereign's appetite for power? Have you learned nothing from history? Power unchecked always expands until it consumes everything. Your Leviathan becomes a monster that devours its own people.
Better a Leviathan that maintains order than your armed mobs deciding which laws to obey. Your Roman Republic that you worship so devoutly murdered magistrates in the streets. They stabbed Caesar 23 times in the Senate. That is your armed citizenship in practice.
Caesar was becoming a tyrant. The Senate struck him down to preserve the Republic. That is precisely why citizens must remain armed, to resist those who would make themselves kings.
And their resistance produced what, Niccolo? Decades of civil war, Octavian's absolute rule. Your armed resistance to tyranny created worse tyranny than Caesar ever contemplated. You prove my point with every example.
I prove only that poorly executed resistance fails. But the alternative you offer is permanent slavery. Under your system, the American government disarms drug users, then expands the category year by year until the sovereign faces no armed populace whatsoever.
If that produces order and prevents civil war, then yes, absolutely yes, the sovereign's power must be absolute or it is nothing. Your limitations and checks and balances produce only paralysis and conflict.
They produce liberty, something you have never valued because you mistake every exercise of freedom for incipient chaos. You see citizens bearing arms and imagine only violence, never considering that armed citizens might preserve peace through deterrence.
Deterrence against whom? The sovereign? You admit it. You want citizens armed to threaten their government. That is the definition of civil war waiting to happen. Drug users with guns represent exactly this threat multiplied.
Drug users represent a pretext. Can you not see the mechanism at work? The government identifies an unpopular group, disarms them under claims of public safety, then expands the definition until everyone becomes suspect.
You catastrophize from reasonable policy. Drug users demonstrate impaired judgment. The sovereign reasonably concludes they should not possess deadly weapons. This requires no conspiracy theory about expanding categories.
Every tyranny begins with reasonable policies. The Romans did not wake up under Tiberius overnight. They surrendered liberty step by step, always for safety, always for order, until they had nothing left to surrender.
Better Tiberius than civil war. You refuse to acknowledge the alternative to sovereign power. It is not your imaginary virtuous republic. It is blood in the streets. It is neighbor killing neighbor. It is the war of all against all.
You witnessed one civil war and concluded all liberty must die. I have studied centuries of republics and tyrannies. Armed citizens preserve freedom. Disarmed subjects suffer slavery. This case permits the first step toward disarmament.
This case permits sensible restrictions on dangerous individuals. You transform every practical measure into apocalyptic tyranny. Not every limit on arms creates despotism. The sovereign must possess discretion to maintain order.
And who limits that discretion, Thomas? You grant unlimited power, then express surprise when it expands without bound. The sovereign you describe has no reason to stop at drug users. Why not disarm anyone who disagrees with government policy?
Because the sovereign's interest lies in maintaining order, not persecuting the innocent. A wise sovereign disarms only genuine threats. Your paranoid fantasies about tyrannical expansion ignore that sovereigns benefit from peaceful, productive subjects.
Peaceful and disarmed. You describe subjects, not citizens. Men who depend entirely on the sovereign's mercy for protection. You call this wisdom when it is cowardice disguised as political philosophy.
Cowardice? I call it learning from experience. You romanticize resistance while ignoring its costs. Every armed uprising, every civil war, every rebellion produces mountains of corpses. I choose order over your blood-soaked liberty.
You choose chains. You philosophize submission and call it sophistication. At least admit you prefer slavery to the risks of freedom. Stop pretending your Leviathan serves any purpose beyond crushing human dignity.
Human dignity requires being alive. Your liberty means nothing to corpses rotting in civil war. The sovereign protects life itself. That is the entire foundation of civil society. Drug users with guns threaten that fundamental purpose.
So you disarm them. Then you disarm the next group. And the next, until your precious sovereign stands atop a mountain of disarmed, defenseless subjects. You have constructed a philosophy that guarantees tyranny.
And you have constructed one that guarantees civil war. Your armed citizens will inevitably fracture into factions. They will fight over religion, territory, politics, anything. That is human nature in the state of nature.
Human nature in republics creates virtue through participation. Human nature under tyrants creates servility and vice. You take the worst of humanity and make it permanent through your absolute sovereign.
I take humanity as it is, violent, selfish, and competitive. Only absolute authority prevents that nature from destroying society. Your virtuous republic never existed except in your imagination.
Rome existed for 5 centuries. It fell only when it abandoned the principles that made it great. Armed citizens, civic virtue, resistance to tyranny. Everything you despise because you prefer order to justice.
Yes, I prefer order to your justice, because your justice produces only chaos and bloodshed. Let the sovereign determine right and wrong. Let the sovereign maintain peace. That is civilization's only hope.
That is civilization's death. You would have humanity prostrate forever before power. No resistance, no dignity, no freedom. Just endless submission to whoever claims sovereignty. You disgust me, Thomas.
And your recklessness terrifies me. You would arm every malcontent and call it liberty. You would paralyze government with your checks and limitations, then act shocked when society collapses. You learned nothing from Florence's fall.
If you enjoyed watching Thomas grovel before power and philosophize his own enslavement, please like and subscribe. Unless you too prefer bootlicking to thinking, in which case Hobbes is your perfect intellectual guide.
Do subscribe if you can stomach Niccolo's dangerous romanticism. He learned nothing from his republic's destruction and would repeat every mistake. Subscribe for actual philosophy, not his adolescent rebellion fantasies that produce only corpses and chaos.